Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading The Colors of Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley, starting with chapter 6. But first, reading updates. I am reading, oh, I didn't bring it over here, but I am reading still In the Life of Puppets by TJ Klune. I'm reading it because it won for Best Science Fiction and for 2023, and I have 150 pages to read. I just made that number up. That's probably wrong. But I'm hoping to finish it this week so that I can move on to other books. I did pick up two other books from the library today. Oopsie daisy. So I picked up Blue Lock Volume 6 and The Rachel Incident, which I had on hold for a very long time, but and it just came in. I just got it. But since I have put it on hold, people that I know have read it and despise it. So that's cool. That's cool. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. I'll start it. And but it sounds like it's going to be something that I stop reading, a DNF, if you will. And I am still listening to Bird Box by Josh Mallerman. I have 2.5 hours to go. I'm listening it on 1.5 speed, uh, which is nice. If you didn't know that you could do that with digital audiobooks, you can. You can up the speed if it's a little bit too slow. Listening at like 2 speed is insane for me, but that's cool. Let's see. I think that's it. I think that's all that I'm reading. So yeah, I guess we'll start with The Colors of Space. The Colors of Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley. So we started it last week. We've read five chapters. We're starting with chapter 6 today. What has happened so far? We have our main boy, whose name is Bart, but is going by a different name because, okay, start over. We have our main boy, Bart, who is just graduated from the academy, and he's waiting for his dad to go back to their home planet, Vega. And he is under the assumption that he is going to be working with his dad, who does like transport and stuff like that. The ship comes in that is supposed to have his dad, and it has another guy who is acting like his dad, and he's like, you need to act like your dad right now because you are in danger, or you need to act like I'm your dad right now because you are in danger. So he goes along with this charade. They take a ship elsewhere, and as they're in this like traveling ship still on this planet, the guy reveals himself to have known his dad like a long time ago, like before he was born, before his dad was married, all of these things. And so he's doing his dad a favor. And so he's like, I can't really, like, I don't really know any details, but here is this. And he gives him money, and he gives him new identification cards. And he's like, your dad told me to tell you the eighth color and Raynor 3. And Bart is like, okay, but like, I don't know what that means. And the guy is like, yeah, I don't either. So then he drops Bart off on this transport to find Raynor 3 and to get this alien race away from Bart and away from the suspicion. This guy who, I forgot his name. Sorry. But this guy who, he like flies the ship erratically and like starts like dive bombing so that his ship will be shot down. And so makes that sacrifice so that Bart can get away. And when they observe the remains of the ship, it looks like there were two people. So that's how he sort of saved Bart in that situation. So Bart goes on the ship with this new identity, David Briscoe, and he runs into somebody that he knows, and he has to pretend that he doesn't know him, blah, 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 all these things. And then he hides into his room for the rest of the time because he can't risk other people like blowing his cover. And they get to like where he's going to disembark, and he runs into that same guy again, and like his friend tricks him in being like, ah, see, I knew that it was you. But like they have this discussion like, oh, I have to do this by myself. Like I can't bring you into it. Everything is dangerous. I don't know what's going on. Blah blah blah. He leaves the ship. He disembarks from the ship, and the alien race is the Lhari, and they cannot see colors. So even if they're given a description of what somebody looks like, they have to have somebody tell them like what the person looks like what color hair does this person have, blah blah blah. So they're not easily able to identify people. Um so Bart goes away or disembarks, terrible pun. Um, and he is like maneuvering himself away, trying not to get caught, all of these things, and he runs into a door that says the eighth color and also Raynor 1. And so Bart goes in thinking that if Raynor 1 is here, maybe Raynor 3 will also be here. He talks to Raynor 1. Raynor 1 is convinced that Bart is who he is and brings out Raynor 3. Raynor 3 is like, cool, glad you're here, come with me. And so Bart goes with Raynor 3. Raynor 3 reveals after Bart keeps saying like, dude, where's my dad? Like, I need to get to him, all of these things. Like, I have so many questions, blah, blah, blah. And where we left off was Raynor 3 telling Bart that his dad is dead and that he killed him. Bum, bum, bum. So, super exciting. What's gonna happen? I don't know. But it'll be cool. It'll be cool. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. Chapter 6. For a moment, Bart stared, frozen, unable to move, his very ears refusing the words he heard. Had this all been another cruel trick, then? A trap? A betrayal? He rose and looked wildly around the room as if the glass walls were a cage closing in on him. Murderer! He flung at Raynor and took a step toward him, his clenched fists coming up. He'd been shoved around too long, but here he had one of them right in front of him, and for once, he'd hit back. He'd start by taking Raynor 3 apart, in small pieces. You rotten murderer! Raynor 3 made no move to defend himself. Bart, he said compassionately, sit down and listen to me. No, I'm no murderer. I shouldn't have put it that way. Bart's hands dropped to his sides, but he heard his voice crack with pain and grief. I suppose you'll tell me he was a spy or a traitor, and you had to kill him? Not even that. I tried to save your father. I did everything I could. I'm no murderer, Bart. I killed him, yes. God forgive me, because I'll never forgive myself. Bart's fists unclenched, and he stared down at Raynor 3, shaking his head in bewilderment and pain. I knew he was dead. I knew it all along. I was trying not to believe it, but I knew. I liked your father. I admired him. He took a long chance, and it killed him. I could have stopped him. I should have stopped him, but how could I? Where did I have the right to stop him after what I did to... He stopped, almost mid-word, as if a switch had been turned. But Bart was not listening. He swung away, striding to the door as if he would kick it in, striking it with his two clenched fists, his whole being in revolt. Dad. Oh, Dad. I kept going. I thought at the end of it you'd be here and it would all be over. But here I am at the end of it all, and you're not here. You won't ever be here again. Dimly, he knew when Raynor 3 rose and left him alone. He leaned his head on his clenched fists and cried. After a long time, he raised his head and blew his nose, his face setting itself in new, hard, unaccustomed lines, slowly coming to terms with the hard, painful reality. His father was dead. His dangerous, dead in earnest game of escape had no happy ending of reunion with his father. They couldn't sit together and laugh about how scared he had been. His father was dead, and he, Bart, was alone and in danger. His face looked very grim, indeed, and years older than he was. After a long time, Raynor III opened the door quietly. "Come, have something to eat, Bart." "I'm not hungry." "Well, I am," Raynor III said, "and you ought to be. You'll need it." He pulled knobs, and the appropriate tables and chairs extruded themselves from the walls. Raynor unsealed hot cartons and spread them on the table, saying lightly, "Looks good. Not that I can claim any credit. I subscribe to a food service that delivers them hot by pneumatic tube." Bart felt sickened by the thought of eating, but when he put a polite fork in the food, he discovered that he was famished and ate up everything in sight. When they had finished, Raynor dumped the cartons into a disposal chute, went to a small portable bar, and put a glass into his hand. "Drink this." Bart touched his lips to the glass, made a face, and put it away. "Thanks, but I don't drink." "Call it medicine. You'll need something," Raynor III said crossly. "I've got a lot to tell you, and I don't want you going off half-primed in the middle of a sentence. If you'd rather have a shot of tranquilizer, all right. Otherwise, I prescribe that you drink what I gave you." He gave Bart a quick, wry grin. "I really am a medic, you know." Feeling like a scolded child, Bart drank. It burned his mouth, but after it was down, he felt a sort of warm burning in his insides that gradually spread a sense of well-being all through him. It wasn't alcohol, but whatever it was, it had quite a kick. "Thanks," he muttered. "Why are you taking this trouble, Raynor? There must be danger. Don't you know?" Raynor broke off. "Obviously you don't. Your mother never said much about your Mentorian family tree, I suppose. She was a Raynor." He smiled at Bart, a little ruefully. "I won't claim a kinship privileges until you decide how much to trust me." Raynor III settled back. "It's a long story, and I only know part of it," he began. "Our family, the Raynors, have traded with the Lhari for more generations than I can count. When I was a young man, I qualified as a medic on the Lhari ships, and I've been star-hopping ever since. People call us the slaves of the Lhari." "Maybe we are," he added wryly. "But I began it just because space is where I belong, and there's nowhere else that I've ever wanted to be, and I'll take it at any price. I never questioned what I was doing until a few years ago. It was your father who made me wonder if we Mentorians were blind and selfish. This privilege ought to belong to everyone, not just the Lhari. More and more, the Lhari monopoly seemed wrong to me, but I was just a medic. And if I involved myself in any conspiracy against the Lhari, they'd find it out in the routine psych checking. And then we worked out how it could be done. Before every trip, with self-hypnosis and self-suggestion, I erase my own memories, a sort of artificial amnesia, so that the Lhari can't find out any more than I want them to find out. Of course, it also means that I have no memory, while I'm on the Lhari ships, of what I've agreed to when I'm—" His face suddenly worked, and his mouth moved without words, as if he had run into some powerful barrier against speech. It was a full minute, while Bart stared in dismay, before he found his voice again, saying, "So far, it was just a sort of loose network, trying to put together stray bits of information that the Lhari didn't think important enough to censor. And then came the big breakthrough. There was a young apprentice astrogator named David Briscoe. He'd taken some runs in special test ships and read some extremely obscure research data from the early days of the contact between men and Lhari, and he had a wild idea. He did the bravest thing anyone has ever done. He stripped himself of all identifying data, so that if he died, no one would be in trouble with the Lhari, and stowed away on a Lhari ship. But Bart's lips were dry. Didn't he die in the warp drive? Slowly, Raynor 3 shook his head. No, he didn't. No drugs, no cold sleep, but he didn't die. Don't you see, Bart? He leaned forward urgently. It's all a fake. The Lhari have just been saying that to justify their refusal to give us the secret to the catalyst that generates the warp drive frequencies. Such a simple lie, and it's worked for all these years. A Mentorian found him and didn't have the heart to turn him over to the Lhari, so he was smuggled clear again. But that Mentorian underwent the routine brain checks at the end of the voyage. The Lhari found out what had happened. They didn't know Briscoe's name, but they wrung that Mentorian out like a wet dishcloth and got a description that was as good as fingerprints. They tracked down young Briscoe and killed him. They killed the first man he'd talked to. They killed the second. The third was your father. The murdering devils. Raynor sighed. Your father and Briscoe's father were old friends. Briscoe's father was dying with incurable heart disease. His son was dead, and old Briscoe had only one thought in his mind: to make sure he didn't die for nothing. So he took your father's papers, knowing they were as good as a death warrant, slipped away and boarded a Lhari ship that led roundabout to stars where the message hadn't reached yet. He led them a good chase. Did he die, or did they track him down and kill him? Bart bowed his head and told the story. Meanwhile, Raynor 3 continued, your father came to me, knowing I was sympathetic, knowing I was a Lhari-trained surgeon. He had just one thought in his mind: to do, again, what David Briscoe had done, and make sure the news got out this time. He cooked up a plan that was even braver and more desperate. He decided to sign on a Lhari ship as a member of the crew. As a Mentorian? Bart asked. But something cold, like ice water, trickling down his back, told him this was not what Raynor meant. The brainwashing. No, said Raynor. Not as a Mentorian. He couldn't have escaped the psych checking. As a Lhari, Bart gasped. How? Men and Lhari are very much alike, Raynor 3 said. A few small things, skin color, the shape of the ears, the hands and claws, keep humans from seeing that the Lhari are men. Don't say that, Bart almost yelled. Those filthy, murdering devils. You call those monsters men? I've lived among the Lhari all my life. They're not devils, Bart. They have their reasons. Physiologically, the Lhari are, well, humanoid, if you like that better. They're a lot more like a man than a man is like, for instance, a gorilla. Your father convinced me that with minor plastic and facial surgery, he could pass as a Lhari. And finally I gave in and did the surgery. And it killed him. Not really. It was a completely unforeseeable thing. A blood clot broke loose in a vein and lodged in his brain. He was dead in seconds. It could have happened at any time, he said. Yet I feel responsible, even though I keep telling myself I'm not. And I'll help you as much as I can. For his sake, and for your mother's. The Lhari don't watch me too closely. They figure that anything I do, they'll catch in the brainwashing. But I'm still one step ahead of them, as long as I can erase my own memories. Bart was sifting it all, slowly, in his mind. Why was Dad doing this? What could he gain? You know we can build ships as good as the Lhari ships, but we don't know anything about the rare catalyst they use for warp drive fuel. Captain Steele had hopes of being able to discover where they got it. But couldn't they find out where the Lhari ships go for fueling? No. There's no way to trail a Lhari ship, he reminded Bart. We can follow them inside a star system, but then they pop into warp drive and we don't know where they go when they aren't running between our stars. We've gathered together what information we do have, and we know that after a certain number of runs in our part of the galaxy, ships take off in the direction of Antares. There's a ship due to come in here in about 10 days, called the Swiftwing, which is just about due to make the Antares run. Captain Steele had managed to arrange, I don't know how, and I don't want to know how, for a vacancy on that ship, and somehow he got credentials. You see, it's a very good spy system, a network between the stars. But the weak link is this. Everything, every message, every man has to travel back and forth by the Lhari ships themselves. He rose, shaking it all off impatiently. Well, it's finished now. Your father is dead. What are you going to do? If you want to go back to Vega, you can probably convince the Lhari you're just an innocent bystander. But they don't hurt bystanders or children, Bart. They aren't bad people. They're just protecting their business monopoly. The safest way to handle it would be this. Let me erase your memories of what I've told you tonight. Then just let the Lhari capture you. They won't kill you. They'll just give you a light psych check. When they find out you don't know anything, they'll send you back to Vega, and you can spend the rest of your life in peace, running Vega, Interplanet, and 8 colors. Bart turned on him furiously. You mean go home like a good little boy and pretend none of this ever happened? What do you think I am, anyhow? Bart's chin set in the new, hard line. What I want is a chance to go where Dad left off. It won't be easy, and it could be dangerous, Raynor 3 said. But there's nothing else to be done. We had the arrangements all made, and now somebody's got to take the dangerous risk of calling them off. Are you game for a little plastic surgery? Just enough to change your looks again with new forged papers? You can't go by the Swiftwing. It doesn't carry passengers. But there's another route you can take. Bart sprang up. No, he said. I know a better way. Let me go on the Swiftwing, in Dad's place, as a Lhari. Bart, no, Raynor 3 said. You'd never get away with it. It's too dangerous. But his gold eyes glinted. Why not? I speak Lhari better than Dad ever did, and my eyes can stand Lhari lights. You said yourself it's going to be a dangerous job just calling off all the arrangements, so let's not call them off. Just let me take Dad's place. Bart, you're only a boy. What was Dave Briscoe? No, Raynor. Dad left me a lot more than Vega Interplanet, and you know it. I'll finish what he started, and then maybe I'll begin to deserve what he left me. Raynor 3 gripped Bart's hand. He said in a voice that shook, All right, Bart. You're your father's son. I can't say more than that. I haven't any right to stop you. All right, end of chapter 6. So Raynor 3, well, Bart is still reeling from the news that his dad's dead and that Raynor 3 killed him. And then Raynor 3 actually goes on to explain what has happened. And they have this whole plot that his dad was going to go onto a Lhari ship as a Lhari so that he could figure out their fuel to get into warp drive, because the Lhari are not sharing any information to anybody outside of their race. So that was their plan. But Dad is no longer with us. And so Raynor 3 is like, okay, it's going to be very dangerous, but let's call everything off. And Bart is like, heck no. I'm going to go in the place of my dad. I'm going to go in as a Lhari. Like, I already speak better Lhari than my dad ever did. My eyes are very fine. My eyes are great. They can withstand, like, the same amount of brightness that Lhari can. Let me go. And, like, I don't want my dad to, like, die in vain type of a thing. Like, he left all of this. I'm going to finish it out. And that's where chapter 6 ended. So, little sip. Let's do it. This next chapter is a little bit longer, so get cozy, get a little snacky. All right. Chapter 7. All right, Bart. Today we'll let you look at yourself, Raynor 3 said. Bart smiled under the muffling layers of bandage around his face. His hands were bandaged, too, and he had not been permitted to look in a mirror. But the transition had been surprisingly painless, or perhaps his sense of well-being had been due to Raynor 3 slipping him some drug. He'd been given injections of a chemical that would change the color of his skin. There had been minor operations on his face, his hands, his feet. Let's see you get up and walk around. Bart obeyed awkwardly, and Raynor frowned. Hurt? Not exactly, but I feel as if I were limping. That's to be expected. I changed the angle of the heel tendon and the muscle of the arch. You're using a different set of muscles when you walk. Until they harden up, you'll have some assorted Charlie horses. Have trouble hearing me? No, though I'd hear better without all these bandages, Bart said impatiently. All in good time. Any trouble breathing? No, except for the bandages. Fine. I changed the shape of your ears and nostrils, and it might have affected your hearing or your breathing. Now, listen, Bart. I'm going to take the bandages off your hands first. Sit down. Bart sat across the table from him, obediently sticking out his hands. Raynor 3 said, Shut your eyes. Bart did as he was told and felt Raynor 3's long fingers working at the bandages. Move each finger as I touch it. Bart obeyed. And Raynor said neutrally, Good. Now take a deep breath and then open your eyes. Impatiently, Bart flicked his lids open. In spite of the warning, his breath went out in a harsh, jolting gas. His hands lay on the table before him, but they were not his hands. The narrow, long fingers were pearl gray, tipped with whitish-pink claws that curved out over the tips. Nervously, Bart moved one finger, and the long claw flicked out like a cat's, retracted. He swallowed. Golly, he felt strangely wobbly. A beautiful job, if I do say so. Be careful not to scratch yourself, and practice picking up small things. Bart saw that the long, grayish claws were trembling. How did you make the claws? Quite simple, really, Raynor beamed. I injected protein compounds into the nail matrix, which speed up nail growth terrifically, and then, as they grew, shaped them. Joining on those tiny muscles for the retracting mechanism was the tricky part, though. Bart was moving his hands experimentally. Once over the shock, they felt quite normal. The claws didn't get in his way half so much as he'd expected when he picked up a pen that lay beside him and, with the blunt tip, made a few of the strange-looking dots and wedges that were the Lhari alphabet. "Practice writing this," said Raynor 3, and laid a plastic-encased folder down beside him. It was a set of ship's papers printed in Lhari. Bart read it through, seeing that it was made out of the equivalent of astrogator first class Bartol. "That's your name now. The name your father would have used. Memorize it. Get used to the sound of it. Practice writing it. Don't worry too much about the rating. It's an elementary one, what we'd call apprentice rating, and I have a training tape for you anyhow. My brother got hold of it. Don't ask me how, and don't ask him." "When am I going to see my face?" "When I think you're ready for the shock," Raynor said bluntly. "It almost threw you when I showed you your hands." It's true. He made Bart walk around with some... No. He made Bart walk around some more briefly. Slowly, he unwound the bandages, then turned and picked up a mirror at the bottom of his medic's case, turning it right side up. "Here. But take it easy." But when Bart looked in the mirror, he felt no unexpected shock, only an unnerving revulsion. His hair was bleached white and fluffy, almost feathery to the touch. His skin was grayish rose, and his eyelids had been altered just enough to make his eyes look long, narrow, and slanted. His nostrils were mere slits, and he moved his tongue over his lips that felt oddly thin. "I did as little to your teeth as I thought I could get away with. Kept the front ones," Raynor 3 told him. "So if you get a toothache, you're out of luck. You won't dare go to a Lhari dentist. I could have done more, but it would have made you look too freakish when we changed you back to human again. If you live that long," he added grimly. "I hadn't thought about that. And if Raynor is going to forgive me, who will do it?" The cold knot of fear, never wholly absent, moved in him again. Watching his face, Raynor 3 said gently, "It's a big network, Bart. I'm not telling you much, for your own safety. But when you get to Antares, they'll tell you all you need to know." He lifted Bart's oddly clawed hands. "I warned you, remember? The change isn't completely reversible. Your hands will always look strange. The fingers had to be lengthened, for instance. I wanted to make you as safe as possible among the Lhari. I think you'll pass anything but an X-ray. Just to be careful not to break any bones." He gave Bart a package. "This is the Lhari training tape. Listen to it as often as you can, then destroy it. Completely. Before you leave here. The Swiftwing is due in port 3 days from now, and they stay here a week. I don't know how we'll manage it, but I'll guarantee there'll be a vacancy on one astrogator first class on that ship." He rose. "And now I'm going back to town and erase the memory." He stopped, looking intently at Bart. "So if you see me, stay away from me, and don't speak, because I won't know you from any other Lhari. Understand? From here on, you're on your own, Bart." He held out his hand. "This is the rough part, son." His face moved strangely. "I'm part of this network between the stars, but I don't know what I've done before, and I'll never know how it comes out. It's funny to stand here and look at you and realize that I won't even remember you." The gold-glinted eyes blinked rapidly. "Goodbye, Bart. And good luck, son." Bart took his hand, deeply moved, with the strange sense that this was another death, a worse one than Briscoe's. He tried to speak, and couldn't. "Well," Raynor's mouth twisted into a wry grin. "Ouch! Careful with those claws. The Lhari don't shake hands." He turned abruptly, and went out the door, and out of Bart's life. while Bart stood at the dome window, feeling alone as he had never felt alone before. He had to wait 6 days, and they felt like 6 eternities. He played the training tape over and over. With his academy background, it wasn't nearly so difficult as he feared. He read and reread the set of papers identifying him as Astrogator First Class Bartol, forged, he supposed. Or was there, somewhere, a real Bartol? The last morning he slept uneasily late. He finished his last meal as a human, spent part of the day removing all traces of his presence from Raynor's home, burned the training tape, and finally got into the silky, silvery tights and cloak that Raynor had provided. He could use his hands now, as they belonged to him. He even found the claws handy and useful. He could write his signature and copy out instructions from the training tape without a moment's hesitation. Toward dusk, a young Lhari slipped unobserved out of Raynor's house and hiked unnoticed to the edge of a small city nearby, where he mingled with the crowd and hired a sky cab from an unobservant human driver to take him to the spaceport city. The sky cab driver was startled, but not, Bart judged, unusually so, to pick up a Lhari passenger. Been doing a little sightseeing on your planet, eh? That's right, Bart said in Universal, not trying to fake his idea of the Lhari accent. Raynor had told him that only a few of the Lhari had the characteristic sibilant R and S, and warned him against trying to imitate it. Just speak naturally. There are dialects of Lhari just as there are dialects of the different human languages, and they all sound different in Universal somehow. Just looking around some. The skycab driver frowned and looked down at his controls, and Bart felt curiously snubbed. Then he remembered. He himself had little to say to the Lhari when they spoke to him. He was an alien, a monster. He couldn't expect to be treated like a human being anymore. When the skycab let him off before the spaceport, it felt strange to see how the crowds edged away from him as he made a way through them. He caught a glimpse of himself in one of the mirror ramps, a tall, thin, strange form in a metallic cloak, head crested with feathery white, and felt overwhelmingly homesick for his own familiar face. He was beginning to feel hungry, and realized that he could not go into an ordinary restaurant without attracting attention. There were refreshment stands all over the spaceport, and he briefly considered getting a snack at one of these. No, that was just putting it off. The time had to come when he must face his fears and test his disguise among the Lhari themselves. Reviewing his knowledge of the construction of spaceports, he remembered that one side was the terminal, where humans and visitors and passengers were freely admitted. The other side, for Lhari and their Mentorian employees only, contained, along the business offices of many sorts, a sort of arcade with amusement centers, shops, and restaurants catering to the personnel of the Lhari ships. With 9 or 10 ships docking every day, Raynor had assured him that a strange Lhari face would be lost in the crowds very easily. He went to one of the doors marked Danger, Lhari lights beyond, and passed through the glaring corridor of offices and storage warehouses, finally coming out into a sort of wide mall. The lights were fierce, but he could endure them without trouble now, though his head ached faintly. Raynor, testing his light tolerance, had assured him that he could endure anything the Lhari could, without permanent damage to his optic nerves, though he would have headaches until he got used to them. There were small shops and what looked like bars, and a glass-fronted place with a sign lettered largely in black letters, a Lhari phrase meaning roughly, "Home away from home. Meals served. Spacemen welcome. Reasonable." Behind him, a voice said in Lhari, "Tell me, does that sign mean what it says? Or is this one of those traps for separating the unwary spaceman from his hard-earned credits? How's the food?" Bart carefully took hold of himself. "I was just wondering that myself." He turned as he spoke, finding himself face to face with a young Lhari in the unadorned cloak of a spaceman without official rank. He knew the Lhari was young because his crest was still white. The young Lhari extended his claw in the closed fist, hidden claw gesture of Lhari greeting. "Shall we take a chance? Ring, son of Rahan, greets you. Bartol, son of Berahun." "I don't remember seeing you in the port, Bartol." "I've mostly worked on the Polaris run." "Way off there?" Ring, son of Rahan, sounded startled and impressed. "You really get around, don't you? Shall we sit here?" They sat on triangular chairs at a three-cornered table. Bart waited for Ring to order and ordered what he did. When it came, it was a sort of egg and fish casserole which Bart found extremely tasty, and he dug into it with pleasure. Allowing for the claws, Lhari table manners were not so much different from human. And remember, their customs differ as much as ours do. If you do something differently, they'll just think you're from another planet with a different culture. "Have you been here long?" "A day or so. I'm off the Swiftwing." Bart decided to hazard his luck. "I was told there's a vacancy on the Swiftwing." Ring looked at him curiously. "There is," he said, "but I'd like to know how you found it out. Captain Varangul said that anyone who talked about it would be sent to Cleto for 3 cycles. But what happened to you? Miss your ship?" "No, I've been laying off. Traveling, sightseeing, bumming around," Bart said. "But I'm tired of it, and now I'd like to sign out again." "Well, we could use another man. This is the long run we're making, out to Antares and then home, and if anybody has to work extra shifts, it's no fun. But if old Varangil knows that there's been talk in the port about Clanerol jumping ship, or whatever happened to him, we'll all have to walk wide of his temper." Bart was beginning to relax a little. Ring apparently accepted him without scrutiny. At this close range, Ring did not seem a monster, but just a young fellow like himself, hardy, good-natured, in fact, not unlike Tommy. Bart chased the thought away as soon as it sneaked into his brain. One of those things, like Tommy. Then, rather grimly, he reminded himself, "I'm one of those things," he said irritably. "So, how do I account for asking your captain for the place?" Ring cocked his fluffy crest to one side. "I know," he said. "I told you. I'll say you're an old friend of mine, but you don't know that Varangul's like when he gets mad. But what he doesn't know, he won't shout about." He shoved back the triangular chair. "Who did tell you, anyway?" This was the first real hurdle, and Bart's brain raced desperately. But Ring was not listening for an answer. "I suppose somebody gossiped, or one of those fool Mentorians picked it up. Got your papers? What rating?" "Astrogator, first class." "Clarinol was second, but you can't have everything, I suppose." Ring led the way through the arcades, out across a guarded sector, passing half a dozen of the huge ships lying in their pits. Finally, Ring stopped and pointed. "This is the old hulk?" Bart had traveled only in Lhari passenger ships, which were new and fresh and sleek. This ship was enormous, ovoid like the egg of some space monster, the sides dented and discolored, thin films of chemical discoloration lying over the glassy, metallic hull. Bart followed Ring. This was real. It was happening. He was signing out for his first interstellar cruise on one of the Lhari ships. Not a Mentorian assistant, half trusted, half tolerated, but one of the crew themselves. If I'm lucky, he reminded himself grimly. There was Lhari, in the black-banded officer's cloak, at the doorway. He glanced at Ring's papers. "Friend of mine," Ring said, and Bart proffered his folder. The Lhari gave it a casual glance, handed it back. "Old Baldy on board?" Ring asked. "Where else?" the officer laughed. "You don't think he'd relax with cargo not loaded, do you?" They seemed casual and normal, and Bart's confidence was growing. They had accepted him as one of their own. But the great ordeal still lay before him, an interview with the Lhari captain, and the idea had Bart sweating scared. The corridors and decks seemed larger, wider, more spacious, but shabbier than the clean, bright, commercial passenger decks Bart had seen. Dark-lensed men were rolling bales of cargo along on wheeled dollies. The corridors seemed endless. More to hear the sound of his own voice and reassure himself of his ability to speak and be understood than because he cared, he asked Ring, "What's your rating?" "Well, according to the logbooks, I'm in expert class 2 metals fatigue," said Ring. "That sounds very technical and interesting, but what it means is just that I go all over the ship inch by inch, and when I finish, start all over again at the other end. Most of what I do is just boss around the maintenance crews and snarl at them about spots of rust on the paint." They got into a small round elevator, and Ring punched buttons. It began to rise, slowly and creakily, toward the top. "This, for instance," Ring said. I've been yelling for a new cable for 6 months." He turned. "Take it easy, Bartol. Don't let Varngul scare you. He likes to hear the sound of his own voice, but we'd all walk out the lock without space suits for him." The elevator slid to a stop. The sign in Lhari letters said, "Level of Administration, Officer's Deck." Ring pushed at a door and said, "Captain Varngul?" "I thought you were on leave," said a Lhari voice, deeper and slower than most. "What are you doing back here more than 10 milliseconds before strap-in checks?" Ring stepped back for Bart to go inside. The small cabin, with an elliptical bunk slung from the ceiling and a triangular table, was dwarfed by a tall, thin Lhari in a cloak with 4 of the black bands that seemed to denote rank among them. He had a deeply lined face with a lacework of tiny wrinkles around the slanted eyes. His crest was not the high, fluffy white of young Lhari, but broken short near the scalp, grayish-pink showing through, the little feathery ends yellowed with age. He growled, "Come in, then. Don't stand there. I suppose Ring's told you what a tyrant I am. What do you want, Feathertop?" Bart remembered being told that this was the Lhari equivalent of kid or youngster. He fumbled in the capacious folds of his cloak for his papers. His voice sounded shrill even to himself. "Bartol, son of Barahan, in respectful greeting, Ryoko Mori." Honorable Old Bald One, the Lhari equivalent of Sir. "Ring told me there is a vacancy among the astrogators, and I want to sign out." Unmistakably, Varangul's snort was laughter. "So, you've been talking, Ring." Ring snorted. Better that I tell one man that you have to hunt the planet over, or run the long haul with the drive room watches short by one man. Well, well, you're right, Varangel growled. He glared at Bart. On the last planet, one of our men disappeared. Jumped ship. The creases around his eyes deepened, troubled. Probably just gone off the drift, sightseeing. But I wish he'd told me. As it is, I wonder if he's been hurt, killed, kidnapped. Ring said, Who'd dare? It would be reported. Bart knew, with a cold chill, that the missing Clenerol had not simply gone on the drift. No Lhari port would ever see Clenerol, second class, astrogator, again. Bartol, mused the captain, rifling the forged papers. Served on the Polaris run. You are a good long way off your orbit, aren't you? Never been out that way myself. All right, I'll take you on. You can do system programming? Good. Rating in second galaxy mathematics? He nodded, hauled out a sheet of thin, wax-coated fabric, and his claws made rapid imprints in the surface. He passed it to Bart, pointed. Bart hesitated, and Varangel said impatiently, Standard agreement, no hidden clauses. Put your mark on it, Feathertop. Bart realized it was something like a fingerprint they wanted. You'll pass anything but X-rays. He pressed the top of one claw into the wax. Varangel nodded, shoved it on a shelf without looking at it. So much for that, said Ring, laughing, and they came out. The bald one was in good temper. I'm going to the port and celebrate. Not that this dim place is very festive. You? I think I'll stay aboard. Well, if you change your mind, I'll be down there somewhere, Ring said. See you later, shipmate. He raised his closed fist in farewell and went. Bart stood in the corridor, feeling astounded and strange. He belonged here. He had a right to be on board the ship. He wasn't quite sure what to do next. A Lhari, as short and fat as a Lhari could possibly be and still be a Lhari, came, or rather waddled, out of the captain's office. He saw Bartol and said, Are you the new first class? I'm Rugel, coordinator. Rugel had a huge cleft, darkish scar across his lip, and there were 2 bands on his cloak. He was completely bald, and he puffed when he walked. Varangel asked me to show you around. You'll share quarters with Ring. No sense shifting another man. Come down and see the chart rooms, or do you want to leave your kit in your cabin first? I don't have much, Bart said. Rugel's seamed lip widened. That's the way. Travel light when you're on the drift, he confirmed. Rugel took him down to the drive rooms, and here, for a moment, in wonder and awe, Bart almost forgot his disguise. The old Lhari led him to the huge computer which filled one wall of the room, and Bart was smitten with the universality of mathematics. Here was something he knew he could handle. He could do this programming easily enough, but as he stood before the banks of complex yet beautifully familiar levers, the sheer exquisite complexity of it overcame him. To compute the movements of thousands of stars, all moving at different speeds, in different directions, in vast, swirling, directionless chaos of the universe, and yet to be sure that every separate movement would come out to within a quarter of a mile. It was something that no finite brain, man or Lhari, could ever accomplish. Yet their limited brains had built these computers that could do it. Rugal watched him, laughing softly. Well, you'll have enough time down here. I like to have youngsters who are still in the middle of a love affair with their work. Come along, and I'll show you your cabin. Rugal left him in a cabin amidships, small and cramped, but tidy. Two of the oval bunks slung at opposite ends, a small table between them, and drawers filled with pamphlets and manuals and maps. Furtively, ashamed of himself, yet driven by necessity, Bart reached Ring's belongings, wanting to get some idea of what possessions he ought to own. He looked around the shower and toilet facilities with extra care. This was something he couldn't slip up on and be considered even halfway normal. He was afraid Ring would come in and see him staring curiously at something as ordinary to a Lhari as a cake of soap. He decided to go down to the port again and look around the shops. He was not afraid of being unable to handle his work. What he feared was something subtler, that the small items of everyday living, something as simple as a nail file, would betray him. On his way, he looked into the recreation lounge, filled with comfortable seats, vision screens, and what looked like simple pinball machines and mechanical games of skill. There were also stacks of tape reels and headsets for listening, not unlike those humans used. Bart felt fascinated and wanted to explore, but decided he could do that later. Somehow he took the wrong turn coming out of the recreation lounge and went through a door where the sudden dimming of lights told him he was in Mentorian quarters. The sudden darkness made him stumble, thrust out his hands to keep from falling, and an unmistakable human voice said, "Ouch!" "Sorry," Bart said in universal, without thinking. "I admit the lights are dim," said the voice tartly, and Bart found himself looking down as his eyes adjusted to the new light level at a girl. She was small and slight, in a metallic blue coat, in a metallic blue cloak that swept out, like wings, around her thin shoulders. The hood framed a small, kitten-like face. She was a Mentorian, and she was human, and Bart's eyes rested with comfort on her face. She, on the other hand, was looking up with anxiety and uneasy distrust. That's right. I'm a Lhari, a non-human freak. I seem to have missed my way. What are you looking for, sir? The medical quarters are through here. Looking for the elevator down to the crew exits. Through here, she said, reopening the door through which he had come and shading her large, lovely, long-lashed eyes with a slender hand. You took the wrong turn. Are you new on board? I thought all ships were laid out exactly alike. I've only worked on passenger ships. I believe they are somewhat different, said the girl in good Lhari. Well, that is your way, sir. He felt as if he had been snubbed and dismissed. What is your name? She stiffened as if about to salute. Meta, of the House Marnie III, sir. Bart realized he was doing something wholly out of character for a Lhari, chatting casually with a Mentorian. With a wistful glance at the pretty girl, he said a stiff "thank you," and went down the ramp she had indicated. He felt horribly lonely. Being a freak wasn't going to be much fun. End of chapter 7. All right, chapter 7, we start with Bart and Raynor 3, still at Raynor 3's home, and Bart has just undergone some plastic surgery to make him look more like a Lhari because their race is different. Their like facial structures, their fingers are different, their feet are different. Everything is just weird. Not weird, different. And so he does that, and then Bart is just like getting used to things because he has like really long claws and his fingers are elongated and whatever else. And Raynor 3 is like, all right, I'm gonna go forget you. and good luck. The ship arrives in 3 days. It will stay for a week. Somehow there's going to be an opening on this, and you will take that opening. And so, oh, and here's a tape to study. And so Bart is studying blah blah blah. He already knows how to speak and write Lhari. His eyes are like Mentorian eyes, so he's able to handle the super bright lights. And so he goes, and the ship is here, and he meets somebody, a crewmate on the ship named Ring, and Ring introduces him to the captain. The captain signs off on his ability and that he can go about there. Um, and then he's wandering around looking about all of these things. He's most worried that it's not going to be like a big thing that's going to give him away as not being Lhari, but something that is so small and just so like minuscule and not important that's going to give him away, like not knowing that this is soap or whatever it is. And so he's walking around exploring the ship, and he runs into a Mentorian girl. And of course, she's beautiful, and I'm sure that something is going to happen between them. But that is where we ended with that chapter. Chapter 8. He saw the girl again next day when they checked in for blastoff. She was seated at a small desk, triangular like so much of the Lhari furniture, checking a register as they came out of the decontam room, making sure they downed their greenish solution of microorganisms. Papers, please, she marked, and Bart noticed that she was using a red pencil. Bartol, she said aloud. Is that how you pronounce it? She made small scribbles in a sort of shorthand with the red pencil, then made other marks with the black one in Lhari. He supposed the red marks were her own private memoranda, unreadable by the Lhari. Next, please. She handed a cup of the greenish stuff to Ring behind him. Bart went down toward the drive room, and to his own surprise, found himself wishing the girl were a mathematician rather than a medic. It would have been pleasant to watch her down here. Old Rudol, on duty in the drive room, watched Bart strap himself in before the computer. Make sure you check all dials, Admiral, he reminded him, and Bart felt a last surge of panic. This was his first cruise, except for practice runs at the Academy. Yet his rating called him an experienced man on the Polaris run. He'd had the Lhari training tape, which was supposed to condition his responses. But would it? He tried to clench his fist, drove a claw into his palm, winced, and commanded himself to stay calm and keep his mind on whatever he was doing. It calmed him to make the routine check of his dials. Strap down check, said a Lhari with a yellow crest and a rasping voice. New man, huh? He gave Bart's straps perfunctory tugs at shoulders and waists, tightened a buckle. Carol, son of Garin. Bells rang on the ship, and Bart felt the odd, tonic touch of fear. This was it. Varangul strode through the door, his banded cloak sweeping behind him, and took the control couch. Ready from fueling room, sir. Position, Varangul snapped. Bart heard himself reading off a string of figures in Lhari. His voice sounded perfectly calm. Communication. Clear channels from Pylon Dispatch, sir. It was old Rugel's voice. Well, Varangul said, slowly and almost reflectively. Let's take her up, then. He touched some controls. The humming grew. Then, swift, hard, and crushing, weight mashed Bart against his couch. Position. Varangul's voice sounded harsh, and Bart fought the crushing weight of it. Even his eyeballs ached as he struggled to turn the tiny eye muscles from dial to dial, and his voice was a dim croak. 14-7 side reel 12.1149. Hold it to point 1146, Arengel said calmly. Point 1146, Bart said, and his claw stabbed at dials. Suddenly, in spite of the cold weight on his chest, the pain, the struggle, he felt as if he were floating. He managed a long, luxurious breath. He could handle it. He knew what he was doing. He was an astrogator. Later, when Acceleration 1 had reached its apex, and the artificial gravity made the ship a place of comfort again, he went down to the dining hall with Ring and met the crew of the Swift Wing. There were 12 officers and 12 crewmen of various ratings like himself and Ring, but there seemed to be little social division between them, as there would have been on a human ship. Officers and crew joked and argued about formality of any kind. None of them gave him a second look. Later, in the recreation lounge, Ring challenged him to a game with one of the pinball machines. It seemed fairly simple to Bart. He tried it, and to his own surprise, won. Old Rugal touched a lever on the side of the room. With a tiny wishing sound, there we go, shutters opened. The light of Procyon Alpha flooded them, and he looked out through a great viewport into bottomless space. Procyon Alpha, Beta, and Gamma hung at full, rings gently tilted. Beyond them the stars burned, flaming through the shimmers of cosmic dust. The colors, the never-ending colors of space. And he stood here, in a room full of monsters. He was one of the monsters. Which one of the planets was it we stopped on? Rugal asked. I can't tell them apart from this distance. Bartol swallowed. He had almost said, the blue one. He pointed. The big one there, with the rings almost edge on? I think they call it Alpha. It's their planet, said Rugal. I guess they call it what they want to. How about another game? Resolutely, Bart turned his back on the bewitching colors and bent over the pinball machine. The first week in space was a nightmare of strain. He welcomed the hours on watch in the drive room. There alone he was sure of what he was doing. Everywhere else in the ship he was perpetually scared, perpetually on tiptoe, perpetually afraid of making some small and stupid mistake. Once he actually called Aldebaran a red star, but Rugal either did not hear the slip or thought it was repeating what one of the Mentorians, there were 2 aboard besides the girl, had said. The absence of color from speech and life was the hardest thing to get used to. Every star in the manual was listed by light frequency waves, to be checked against a photometer for a specific reading, and it almost drove Bart mad to go through the ritual when the Mentorians were off duty and could not call off the color and the equivalent frequency type for him. Yet, he did not dare skip a single step, or someone might have guessed that he could see the difference between a yellow and a green star before checking them. The Academy ships had had the traditional human signal system of flashing red lights. Bart was stretched taut all the time, listening for a small code-like buzzers and ticks that warned him of filled tanks, leads in need of servicing, answers ready. Ring's metal fatigues testing kit was a bewildering muddle of boxes, meters, rods, and earphones, each buzzing and clicking its characteristic warning. At first he felt stretched to capacity every waking moment, his memory aching with a million details, and lay awake nights thinking his mind would crack under the strain. Then Alpha faded to a dim, bluish shimmer. Beta was eclipsed. Gamma was gone. Procyon dimmed to a failing spark, and suddenly Bart's memory accustomed itself to the load. The new habits were firmly in place, and he found himself eating, sleeping, and working in a settled routine. He belonged to the Swift Wing now. Procyon was almost lost in the viewports when a sort of upswept tempo began to run through the ship, an undercurrent of increased activity. Cargo was checked, inventoried, and strapped in. Ring was given 4 extra men to help him, made an extra tour of the ship, and came back buzzing like a frantic cricket. Bart's computers told him they were forging toward the sidereal location assigned for the first of the warp drive shifts, which would take them some 15 light-years toward Aldebaran. On the final watch before the warp drive shift, the medical officer came around and relieved the Mentorians from duty. Bart watched them go, with a curious, cold, crawling apprehension. Even the Mentorians, trusted by the Lhari, even these were put into cold sleep. Fear grabbed his insides. No human had ever survived the shift into warp drive, the Lhari said. Briscoe, his father, Raynor III. They thought they had proved that the Lhari lied. If they were right, if it was a Lhari trick to reinforce their stranglehold on the human worlds and keep the warp drive for themselves, then Bart had nothing to fear. But he was afraid. Why did the Mentorians endure this? Never quite trusted, isolated among aliens? Raynor III had said, because I belong in space. Because I'm never happy anywhere else. Bart looked out the viewport at the swirl and burn of the colors there. Now that he could never speak of the colors, it seemed he had never been so wholly and wistfully aware of them. They symbolized the thing he could never put into words. So that everyone can have this, not just the Lhari. Rugal watched the Mentorians go, scowling. I wish Medic would find a way to keep them alive through warp, he said. My Mentorian assistant would watch that frequency shift as she got near the bottom of the arc, and I'll bet she could see it. They can see the changes in intensity faster than I can plot them on the photometer. Bart felt goosebumps break out on his skin. Rugal spoke as if the certain death of humans, Mentorians, was a fact. Didn't the Lhari themselves know it was a farce? Or was it? Vorongil himself took the controls for the surge of acceleration, too, which would take them past the light barrier. Bart, watching his instruments to exact position and time, saw the colors of each star shift strangely, moment by moment. The red stars seemed hard to see. The orange-yellow ones burned suddenly like flame. The green ones seemed golden, the blue ones almost green. Dimly he remembered the old story of a red shift in the lights of approaching stars. But here he saw it pure, a sight no human eyes had ever seen, a sight that no eyes had seen, human or otherwise, for the Lhari could not see it. Time, he said briefly to Vorongil. 15 seconds. Rugal looked across from his couch. Bart felt that the old, scarred Lhari could read his fear. Rugal said, through a wheeze, No matter how old you get, Bartol, you are still scared when you make a warp shift. But relax, computers don't make mistakes. Catalyst, Vorongil snapped. Ready. Shift. At first there was no change. Then Bart realized that the stars through the viewport had altered abruptly in size and shade and color. They were not sparks, but strange streaks, like comets, crossing and recrossing long tails that grew longer and longer, moment by moment. The dark night of space was filled with a crisscrossing blaze. They were moving faster than light. They saw the light left by the moving universe as each star hurled in its own invisible orbit, while they tore incredibly through it, faster than light itself. Bart felt a curious, tingling discomfort deep in his flesh, almost an itching, a stinging in his very bones. Lhari flesh is no different from ours. Space through the viewport was no longer space as he had come to know it, but a strange, eerie limbo. The star tracks lengthening, shifting color until they filled the whole viewport with shimmering, gray, recrossing light. The unbelievable reaction of warp drive thrust them through space faster than the lights of the surrounding stars, faster than imagination could follow. The lights in the drive chamber began to dim. Or was he blacking out? The stinging in his flesh was a clawed pain. Briscoe lived through it, they say. The whirling star tracks fogged, coiled, turned colorless worms of light, went into a single vast blur. Dimly Bart saw old Rugal slump forward, moaning softly. Saw the old Lhari pillow his bald head on his veined arms. Then darkness took him, and thinking it was death, Bart felt only numb, regretful, failure. I've failed. Will always fail. The Lhari were right all along. The whirling star tracks fogged, coiled, turned colorless worms of light, went into a single vast blur. Dimly, Bart saw old Rugal slump forward, moaning softly. Saw the old Lhari pillow his bald head on his veined arms. Then darkness took him, and thinking it was death, Bart felt only numb, regretful failure. I failed. Will always fail. The Lhari were right all along. But we tried. By God, we tried. Bartol? A gentle hand, cat claws retracted, came down on his shoulder. Ring bent over him. Good-natured rebuke was in his voice. Why didn't you tell us you got a bad reaction and ask to sign out of this shift? He demanded. Look, poor old Rugal's passed out again. He just won't admit he can't take it, but one idiot on watch is enough. Some people just feel as if the bottom's dropped out of the ship and that's all there is to it. Bart hauled his head upright, fighting a surge of stinging nausea. His bones itched inside, and he was damnably uncomfortable. But he was still alive. I'm fine. You look it, Ring said in derision. Think you can help me get Rugal to his cabin? Bart struggled to his feet, and found that when he was upright, he felt better. Wow, he muttered, then clamped his mouth shut. He was supposed to be an experienced man, a Lhari hardened to space. He said woozily, How long was I out? The usual time, Ring said briskly. About 3 seconds, just while we hit peak warp drive. Feels longer, so they tell me. Sometimes. Time's funny, beyond light speeds. The medic says it's purely psychological, but I'm not so sure. I itch. Blast it. He moved his shoulders in a squirming way, then bent over Rugal, who was moaning, half insensible. Catch hold of his feet, Bartol. Here. Ease him out of his chair. No sense bothering the medics this time. Think you can manage to help me carry him down to the deck? Sure, Bart said, finding his feet and his voice. He felt better as they moved along the highway, the limp, muttering form of the old Lhari insensible in their arms. They reached the officer's deck, got Rugal into his cabin and into his bunk, hauled off his cloak and boots. Ring stood, shaking his head. And they say Captain Voragil's so tough. Bart made a questioning noise. Why, just look, said Ring. He knows it would make poor Ruggles feel as if he wasn't good for much, to order him into his bunk and make him take dope like a Mentorian for every warp shift. So we have this to go through at every jump. He sounded cross and disgusted, but there was a rough, boyish gentleness as he hauled the blanket over the bald old Lhari. He looked up, almost shy. Thanks for helping me with old Baldy. We usually try to get him out before Varangil officially takes notice. Of course, he sort of keeps his back turned, Ring said, and they laughed together as they turned back to the drive room. Bart found himself thinking, Ring's a good kid, before he pulled himself up in sudden shock. He had lived through warp drive. Then, indeed, the Lhari had been lying all along, the vicious lie that maintained their stranglehold monopoly of star travel. He was their enemy again, the spy within their gates, like Briscoe, to be hunted down and killed, but to bring the message loud and clear to everyone. The Lhari lied. The stars can belong to us all. When he got back to the drive room, he saw through the viewpoint that the blur had vanished. The star trails were clear, distinct again, their comet tails shortening by the moment, their colors more distinct. The Lhari were waiting, a few poised over their instruments, a few more standing at the quartz window watching the star trails, some squirming and scratching and grousing about space fleas. The characteristic itching reaction that seemed to be deep down inside the bones. Bart checked his panels, noted the time when they were due to snap back into normal space, and went to stand by the viewport. The stars were reappearing, seeming to steady and blaze out in cloudy splendor through the bright dust. They burned in great streamers of flame, and for the moment he forgot his mission again, lost in the beauty of the fiery lights. He drew a deep, shaking gasp. It was worth it all to see this. He turned and saw Ring, silent, at his shoulder. Me too, Ring said, almost in a whisper. I think every man on board feels that way, a little, only he won't admit it. His slanted gray eyes looked quickly at Bart and away. I guess we're almost down to L point. Better check the panel and report nulls so Medic can wake up the Mentorians. The Swiftwing moved on between the stars. Aldebaran loomed, then faded in the viewports. Another shift jumped them to a star whose human name Bart did not know. Shift followed shift. Spaceport followed spaceport. Sun followed sun. Men lived on most of these worlds, and on each of them a Lhari spaceport rose, alien and arrogant. And on each world men looked at Lhari with resentful eyes, cursing the race who kept the stars for their own. Cargo amassed in the holds of the Swiftwing, from worlds beyond all dreams and strangeness. Bart grew, not bored, but hardened to the incredible. For days at a time, no word of human speech crossed his mind. The blackout at peak of each warp shift persisted. Varangil had given him permission to report off-duty, but since the blackouts did not impair his efficiency, Bart had refused. Ruggles told him that this was the moment of equilibrium, the peak of the faster-than-light motion. Perhaps a true limiting speed beyond which nothing will ever go, Varangil said, touching the charts with a varnished claw. Ruggles' scarred old mouth opened in a thin line. Maybe there's no such thing as a limiting speed. Someday we'll reach true simultaneity, enter warp and come out just where we want to be, at the same time, just a split-second interval. That will be real transmission. Ring scoffed. And suppose you get even better and come out of warp before you go into it. What then, honorable bald one? Ruggles chuckled and did not answer. Bart turned away. It was not easy to keep on hating the Lhari. There came a day when he came on watch to see drawn, worried faces, and when Ring came into the drive room, they threw their levers on automatic and crowded around him, their crests bobbing in question and dismay. Barangil seemed to emit sparks as he barked at Ring. "You found it?" "I found it, inside the hull lining." Barangil swore, and Ring held up a hand in protest. "I only locate metal fatigue, sir. I don't make it." "No help for it, then," Barangil said. "We'll have to put down for repairs. How much time do we have, Ring?" "I give it 30 hours, Ring said briefly, and Varangil gave a long, shrill whistle. "Bartle, what's the closest listed spaceport?" Bart dived for handbooks, manuals, comparative tables of position, and started programming information. The crew drifted toward him, and by the time he finished feeding in the coded information, a row 3 deep of Lhari surrounded him, including all the officers. Barango was right at his shoulder when Bart slipped on his earphones and started decoding the punched strips that fed out the answers from the computer. Nearest port is Kotman 4. It's almost exactly 30 hours away. "I don't like to run it that close." Barangil's face was bitten deep with lines. He turned to Ramilus, head of maintenance. "Do we need spare parts, or just general repairs?" "Just repairs, sir. We have plenty of shielding metal. It is a long job to get through the holes, but there's nothing we can't fix." Barangil flexed his clawed hands nervously, stretching and retracting them. "Ring, you're the fatigue expert. I'll take your word for it. Can we make it 30 hours? Ring looked pale, and there was none of his usual boyish nonsense when he said, "Captain, I swear I wouldn't risk Kotman. You know what crystallization's like, sir. We can't get through the hull lining to repair it in space. If it does go before we land, we wouldn't have the chance of a hydrogen atom in a tank of halogens." Barangil's slanted eyebrows made a single, unbroken line. "What's the word, then? Bartle, find us the closest star with a planet, spaceport or not." Bart's hands were shaking with sudden fear. He checked each digit of their present position, fed it into the computer, waited. Finally wet his lips and plunged, taking the strip from a computer. "This small star, called Meristem, it's a..." He bit his lip hard. He had almost said green. "Type Q. 2 planets with atmosphere within tolerable limits. Not classified as inhabited." "Who owns it?" "I don't have that information on the banks, sir." Barangel beckoned the Mentorian assistant. So apart were Lhari and Mentorian on these ships that Bart did not even know his name. He said, "Look up a star called Meristem for us." The Mentorian hurried away, came back after a moment with the information that it belonged to the Second Galaxy Federation, but was listed as unexplored. Barangil scowled. "Well, we can claim necessity," he said. "It's only 8 hours away, and Kotman's 30. Bartle, plot us a warp drive shift that will land us in that system, and on the inner of the 2 planets, within 9 hours. If it's a Type Q star, that means dim illumination and no spaceport mercury vapor installations. We'll need as much sunlight as we can get." It was the first time that Bart, unaided, had had the responsibility of plotting a warp drive shift. He checked the coordinates of the small green star 3 times before passing them along to Varangel. Even so, when they went into acceleration 2, he felt stinging fear. If I plotted wrong, we could shift into that crazy space and come out billions of miles away. But when the stars steadied and took on their own colors, the blaze of a small green sun was steady in the viewport. "Meristem," Larengal said, taking the controls himself. Let's hope the place is really uninhabited, and that catalog's up to date, lads. It wouldn't be any fun to burn up some harmless village or get shot at by barbarians. And we're setting down with no control tower signals and no spaceport repair crews. So, let's hope our luck holds out for a while yet. Bart, feeling the minute, unsteady trembling somewhere in the ship. Imagination, he told himself. You can't feel metal fatigue somewhere in the hull lying. Echo, the wish. He did not know that he had already had the best luck of his unique voyage, or realize the fantastic luck that had brought him to the small green star, Meristem. End of chapter 8. All right, chapter 8. We are. Bart gets on the ship. Bart gets on the ship, and we're just getting accustomed to ship life as a Lhari. There's just subtle differences, like all of the Lhari like joke along with each other during recreation time. There's no like division between like the different classes or anything like that. Um, Bart is having a really hard time with being able to see colors, because Lhari can't see colors, and so he's trying to pretend to be a Lhari, he's let slip a couple of times, like the red star or something like that, and is just hoping that the people that he's like accidentally slipping to think that he just got that description from a Mentorian who can see colors, and he needs to be very careful when delivering data. Because he can't see colors, he has to check the frequency data and then like proceed to say like what the star is, instead of just being like, yeah, that's blue, or yeah, that's red, or like whatever the color is. So he needs to just be a little bit more careful with things like that. Um, and so they're on their journey, and they're about to hit into like warp speed. I forgot what they call it. They don't call it warp speed, but they call it something. And we have been told by the Lhari that humans cannot survive the speed and the impact of this. And so we're nervous. And all of the Mentorians are like put to sleep, things like that. But we live. So that's another thing that Mentorians are lying about, or that what Lhari are lying about. So, which is kind of great because now Bart is able to like see all of the things that no human has been able to see before, and hopefully gather information that will help like humans, people outside of the Lhari race, know how to travel at warp speed. And there is an issue with the hull, so they have to make a stop, and they're making a stop on this area that is dimly lit for Lhari, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them to see, but also it's not habited, and it's owned by Galaxy to something. And I'm sure that means something. It'll probably come up, but as of right now, it just seems like it's a planet that like nobody is at right now. So that's kind of cool. All right. Chapter 9. The crew of repairmen were working down in the hall, and the Swiftwing was a hell of clanging noise and shuddering heat. Maintenance was working overtime, but the rest of the crew, with nothing to do, stood around in the recreation rooms, tried to play games, cursed the heat and the dreary dimness through the viewports, and twitched at the boiler factory racket from the holds. Toward the end of the third day, the biologist reported air, water, and gravity well within tolerable limits. and Captain Varangel issued permission for anyone who liked to go outside and have a look around. Bart had a sort of ship-induced claustrophobia. It was good to feel solid ground under his feet, and the rays of the sun, even a green sun, on his back. Even more, it was good to get away from the constant presence of the shipmates. During his enforced idleness, their presence oppressed him unendurably. So many tall forms, gray skins, leathery crests. He was always alone. For a change, he felt that he'd like to be alone without Lhari all around him. But as he moved away from the ship, Ring dropped out of the hatchway and hailed him. "Where are you going?" "Just for a walk." Ring drew a deep breath of weariness. "That sounds good. Mind if I come along?" Bart did, but all he could say was, "If you like." "How about let's get some food from the rations clerk and do some exploring?" The sun overhead was a clear greenish gold, the sky strewn with soft, pale clouds that cast racing shadows on the soft grass underfoot, fragrant, pinkish yellow stuff strewn with bright vermilion puffballs. Bart wished he were alone to enjoy it. "How are the repairs coming?" "Pretty well, but Claro got his hand half scorched off, poor fellow. Just luck the same thing didn't happen to me," Ring added. "You know that Mentorian, the young one, the medic's assistant?" "I've seen her. Her name's Meta, I think." Suddenly, Bart wished the Mentorian girl were here with him. It would be nice to hear a human voice. "Oh, is it female? Mentorians all look alike to me," Ring said, while Bart controlled his face with an effort. "Be that as it may, she saved me from having the same thing happen. I was just going to lean against a strip of sheet metal when she screamed at me. Do you think they can really see heat vibrations? She called it red hot." They had reached a line of tall cliffs where a steep rock fall divided off the plain of the edge of the mountains. A few slender, drooping, gold-leaved trees bent graceful branches over a pool. Bart stood fascinated by the play of green sunlight on the emerald ripples, but Ring flung himself down full length on the soft grass and sighed comfortably. "Feels good." "Too comfortable to eat?" They munched in companionable silence. "Look," said Ring at last, pointing toward the cliff. "Holes in the rocks. Caves. I'd like to explore them, wouldn't you?" "They look pretty gloomy to me. Probably full of monsters." Ring patted the hilt of his energon ray. "This will handle anything short of an armor-plated Saurian." Bart shuddered. As part of uniform, he too had been issued one of the energon rays, but he had never used it, and didn't intend to. "Just the same, I'd rather stay out here in the sun." "It's better than vitamin lamps," Ring admitted, "even if it's not very bright." Bart wondered, suddenly and worriedly, about the effects of green sunburn on his chemically altered skin tone. "Well, let's enjoy it while we can," Ring said, "because it seems to be clouding over. I wouldn't be surprised if it rained." He yawned. "Getting bored with this voyage, and yet I don't want it to end, because I'll have to fight it out all over again with my family. My father owns a hotel, and he wants me in the family business, not 500 light years away. None of our family have ever been spacemen before," he explained, "and they don't understand that living on one planet would drive me out of my mind." He sighed. "How did you explain it to your people? That you couldn't be happy in the mud? Or are you a career man?" I guess so. I never thought about doing anything else," Bart said slowly. Ring's story had touched him. He had never realized quite so fully how much alike the two races are, how human the Lhari problems and dreams could seem. Why, of course, the Lhari aren't all spacemen. They have hotel keepers and garbage men and dentists, just as we do. Funny, You never think of them except in space. My mother died when I was very young, Bart said, choosing his words very carefully. My father owned a fleet of interplanetary ships. But you wanted the real thing. Deep space, the stars, Ring said. How did he feel about that? He would have understood, Bart said, unable to keep emotion out of his voice. But he's dead now. He died not long ago. Ring's eyes were bright with sympathy. Well, you were off on the drift. Bad luck, he said gently. He was silent, and when he spoke again it was in a very different tone. But some of the older generations. I had a professor in training school, funny old chap, bald as the hull of the Swiftwing, taught us cosmic ray analysis, and what he didn't know about spiral nebulae could be engraved on my 5th toe claw, and he'd never been off the face of the planet, not even to one of the moons. He was the supervisor of my student lodge, and oh, was he a... The phrase Ring used meant, literally, a soft piece of cake. His feet may have been buried in mud, but his head was off in the great nebula. We had some wild times, Ring reminisced. We'd slip away to the city, strictly against rules, it was an old-style school, and draw lots for one of us to stay home and sign in for all 12. You see, he'd sit there reading, and when one of us came in, just shove the wax at us, with his nose in a text on cosmic dust, never looking up. So the one who stayed home would scrawl a name on it, walk out that back door, come around and sign in again. When there were 12 signed in, of course, the old chap would go on to bed, and late that night, the one who stayed in would sneak down and let us rush in. Ring sat up suddenly, touching his cheek. Was that a drop of rain? And the sun's gone. I suppose we ought to start back, though I hate to leave those caves unexplored. Bart bent to gather up the debris of their meal. He flinched as something hard struck his arm. Ouch! What was that? Ring cried out in pain. It's hail! Sharp pieces of ice were suddenly pelting, raining down all around them, splattering the ground with a harsh, bouncing clatter. Ring yelled, Come on! It's big enough to flatten you! It looked to Bart as if it were at least golf ball size, and seemed to be getting bigger by the moment. Lightning flashed around them in sudden glare. They ducked their heads and ran. Get in under the lee of the cliffs. We couldn't possibly make it back to the Swift. Ring's voice broke off in a cry of pain. He slumped forward, pitched to his knees, then slid down and lay still. What's the matter? Bart, arm curved to protect his skull, bent over the fallen Lhari, but Ring, his forehead bleeding, lay insensible. Bart felt sharp pain in his arm, felt the hail hard as thrown stones raining on his head. Ring was out cold. If they stayed in this, Bart thought despairingly, they'd both be dead. Crouching, trying to duck his head between his shoulders, Bart got his arms under Ring's armpits and half-carried, half-dragged him under the lee of the cliffs. He slipped and slid on the thickening layer of ice underfoot, lost his footing, and came down, hard, one arm twisted between himself and the cliff. He cried out in pain, uncontrollably, and let Ring slip from his grasp. The Lhari boy lay like the dead. Bart bent over him, breathing hard, trying to get his breath back. The hail was still pelting down, showing no signs of lessening. About 5 feet away, one of the dark gaps in the cliff showed wide and menacing, but at least, Bart thought, the hail couldn't come in there. He stooped and got hold of Ring again. A pain like fire went through the wrist he had smashed against the rock. He set his teeth, wondering if it had broken. The effort made him see stars, but he managed somehow to hoist Ring up again and haul him through the pelting hail toward the yawning gap. It darkened around him, and, blessedly, the battering, bruising hail could not reach them. Only an occasional light splinter of ice blew with the bitter wind into the mouth of the cave. Bart laid Ring down on the floor, under the shelter of the rock ceiling. He knelt beside him and spoke his name, but Ring just moaned. His forehead was covered with blood. Bart took one of the paper napkins from the lunch sack and carefully wiped some of it away. His stomach turned at the deep, ugly cut, which immediately started oozing fresh blood. He pressed the edges of the cut together with the napkin, wondering helplessly how much blood Ring could lose without danger, and if he had concussion. If he tried to go back to the ship and fetch the medic for Ring, he'd be stuck by Hale himself. From where he stood, it seemed that the hailstones were getting bigger by the minute. Ring moaned, but when Bart knelt beside him again, he did not answer. Bart could hear only the rushing of wind, the noise of the splattering hail, and a sound of water somewhere. Or was that a rustle of scales, a dragging of strange feet? He looked through the darkness into the depths of the cave, his hand on his shock beam. He was afraid to turn his back on it. This is nonsense, he told himself firmly. I'll just walk back there and see what there is. At his belt he had the small flash lamp, excessively bright, that was, like the energon beam shocker, a part of regulation equipment. He took it out, shining it on the back wall of the cave, then drew a long breath of startlement, and for a moment forgot Ring and his own pain. For the back wall of the cave was an exquisite fall of crystal. Minerals glowed there, giant crystals like jewels, crusted with strange lichen-like growths and colors. There were pale blues and greens, and shimmering among them, a strangely colored crystalline mineral that he had never seen before. It was blue. No, Bart thought. That's just the light. It's more like red. No, it can't be like both of them at once, and it isn't really like either. In this light, Ring moaned, and Bart, glancing round, saw that he was struggling to sit up. He ran back to him, dropping to his knees at Ring's side. It's all right, Ring. Lie still. We're under cover now. What happened? Ring said blurrily. Head hurts. All sparks. All the pretty lights. Can't see you. He fumbled with loose, uncoordinated fingers at his head, and Bart grabbed at him before he poked a claw in his eye. Don't do that, Ring complained. Can't see. He must have a bad concussion, then. It's a nasty cut. Gently, he restrained the Lhari boy's hands. Bartle, what happened? Bart explained. Ring tried to move, but fell limply back. Weren't you hurt? I thought I heard you cry out. A cut or two, but nothing serious, Bart said. I think the hail's stopped. Lie still. I'd better go back to the ship and get help. Give me a hand and I can walk, Ring said. But when he tried to sit up, he flinched, and Bart said, You'd better lie still. He knew that head injuries should be kept very quiet. He was almost afraid to leave Ring for fear the Lhari boy would have another delirious fit and hurt himself. But there was no help for it. The hail had stopped, and the piled heaps were already melting, but it was bitterly cold. Bart wrapped himself in the silvery cloak, glad of its warmth, and struggled back against the slushy, ice-strewn meadow that had been so pink and flowery in the sunshine. The Swiftwing, a monstrous dark egg looming in the twilight, seemed like home. Bart felt the heavenly warmth close around him with a sigh of pure relief, but the second officer, coming up the hatchway, stopped in consternation. You're covered in blood. The hailstorm. I'm all right, Bart said, but Ring's been hurt. You'll need a stretcher. Quickly, he explained. I'll come with you and show you. You'll do no such thing, the officer said. You look as if you've been caught out in a meteor shower, Feathertop. We can't find the place. You go and have those cuts attended to, and... What's wrong with your wrist? Broken? Bart heard, like an echo, the frightening words. Don't break any bones. You won't pass an X-ray. It's all right, sir. When I get washed up, that's an order, snapped the officer. Do you think, on this Pestilential, unlucky planet we can afford any more bad luck. Metals fatigue. Carol burned so badly the medic thinks he may never use his hand again, and now you and Ring getting yourself laid up and out of action. The medic will help me with Ring. That Mentorian girl can look after you. Get moving. He hurried away, and Bart, his head beginning to hurt, walked slowly up the ramp. His whole arm felt numb, and he supported it with his good hand. In the small infirmary, Carol lay groaning in a bunk, his arm bound in bandages, his head moving from side to side. The Mentorian girl, Meta, turned, charging a hypo. She looked pale and drawn. She went to Carol, uncovering his other arm, and made the injection. Almost immediately, the moaning stopped, and Carol lay still. Meta sighed and drew a hand over her brow, brushing away feathery wisps that escaped from the cap tied over her hair. Bartle, you're hurt? Not more burns, I hope. She looks just like a fluffy little kitten, Bart thought incongruously. Fatigue was beginning to blur his reaction. Only a few cuts, he said in universal, though Meta had spoken Lhari. In his weariness and pain he was homesick. He was homesick for the sound of a familiar word. Ring and I were both caught in the hailstorm. He's badly hurt. Sit down here. Bart sat. Meta's hands were skillful and cool as she sponged the blood away from his forehead and sprayed it with some pleasantly cold, mint-smelling antiseptic. Bart leaned back, tireder than he knew, half closing his eyes. That hail must have been enormous. We heard it through the hull. Whatever possessed you to go out into it? It wasn't hailing when we left, Bart said wearily. The sun was as nice and green as it could be. He bit the words off, realizing he had made a slip, but the girl seemed not to hear, fastening a strip of plastic over a cut. She picked up his wrist. Bart flinched in spite of himself, and Meta nodded. I was afraid of that. It may be broken. Better let me x-ray it. No, Bart said harshly. It's all right. I just twisted it. Nothing's broken. Just strap it up. It's pretty badly swollen, the girl said, moving it gently. Does it hurt? I thought so. Bart set his teeth against a cry. It's all right, I tell you. Just because it's black and blue. He heard her breath jolt out. Her fingers clenched painfully on his wounded wrist. She did not hear his cry this time. And the sun was nice and green, she whispered. What are you? Bart felt himself slip sideways. He thought for a moment that he would faint where he sat. Terrified, he looked up at Meta. Their eyes met, and she said, hardly moving her pale lips, Your eyes, they're like mine. Your lashes dark, not white. You're not a Lhari. The pain in his wrist suddenly blurred everything else, but Meta suddenly realized she was gripping it. She gave a little gentle cry and cradled the abused wrist in her palm. No wonder you didn't want it x-rayed, she whispered, biting her lip. She glanced, terrified, at Carol, unconscious in the bunk. No, he can't hear us. I gave him a heavy shot of hypnin. Poor fellow. Go ahead, Bart said bitterly. Yell for your keepers. Her gray eyes blazed at him for a moment. Then, gently, she laid his wrist on the table, went to the infirmary door, and locked it on the inside. She turned around, her face white. Even her lips had lost their color. Who are you? She whispered. Does it matter now? Shocked comprehension swept over her face. You don't think I'd tell them, she whispered. I heard talk, in the Procyon port, of a spy that had managed to get through on a Lhari ship. Her face twisted. You must know about the man on the multiphase. You know they'll make sure I can't hide anything dangerous to the Lhari at the end of the voyage. Meta, concern for her, swept over him. What will they do to you when they find out that you know and didn't tell? Her gray eyes were wide as a kitten's. Why, nothing. The Lhari would never hurt anyone, would they? Brainwashed. He set his mouth grimly. I hope you never find out different. Why would they need to? She asked reasonably. They could just erase the memory. I never heard of a Lhari actually hurting anyone. But something like this. She wavered, looking at him. You look so much like a Lhari. How was it done? How could they do it? Poor fellow, you must be the loneliest man in the universe. Her voice was compassionate. Bart felt his throat tighten and had the awful feeling that he was going to cry. He reached with his good hand for hers, seeking the comfort of a human touch, but she flinched instinctively away. He was a monster to this pretty girl. It looks so real, she said helplessly. Yes, now I can see. You have tiny moons at the base of the nail, and the Lhari don't. Her face worked. It's horrifying. How could you? There was a noise in the corridor. Meta gasped and ran to unlock the door, stood back as the medic and the second officer came in, staggering under Ring's weight. Carefully, they put him into a bunk. The medic straightened, shaking his crest. Did you get that wrist taken care of? Meta stepped between Bart and the officer, reaching for a roll of bandage. I'm working on it now, Ryoko Mori, she said. It only wants strapping up. But her fingers trembled as she wound the gauze, pulling each fold tight. How's Ring? Needs quiet, grunted the medic, and a few sutures. Lucky you got him under cover when you did. Ring said weakly from his bunk. Bartle saved my life. I can think of plenty who'd have run for cover instead of staying out in that stuff long enough to grab me inside. Thanks, shipmate. Meta's hand, with a swift, hard pressure, lingered on Bart's shoulders as she cut the bandage and fastened the end. I don't think that will bother you much now, she whispered fleetingly. I don't dare say it was broken, or they'd insist on x-rays. If it hurts, I'll get you something later for the pain. If you keep it strapped up tight. It will do, Bart said aloud. The tight bondage made it feel a little better, but he felt sick and dizzy, and when the medic turned and saw him, the officer said brusquely, Watch off for you, Bartol. I'll fix the sign-out sheet, but you go to your cabin and get yourself at least 4 hours of sleep. That's an order. Bart stumbled out of the cabin with relief. Safe in his own quarters, he flung himself down on his bunk, shaking all over. He'd come safely through one more nightmare, one more terror, for the moment. Had he put Meta in danger, too? Was there no end to this ceaseless fear? Not only for himself, but for others, the innocent bystanders who stumbled into plots they did not understand. You're doing this for the stars. It's bigger than your fear. It's bigger than you are, or any of the others. He was beginning to think it was a lot too big for him. All right. End of chapter 9. Okay, so we land on this planet, and there is a bit of time for, moving about, recreation, all of those things. And Bart is getting a little claustrophobic, just being on the ship and being surrounded by Lhari and that uneasy feeling, all of that stuff. And so Bart decides that he wants to go out onto the planet and just like soak up this green sun, all of these things. And he runs into Ring. And Ring is very determined to also go outside and also, take a break. And so he's like, yeah, let's go get food and then we'll explore together. So they go and do that, and they're laying out under the sun, and there's a brief moment where Bart is like a little worried because he doesn't know how his surgery to make his skin gray, how it's going to react to a green sunburn. Oops. but he doesn't really want to leave yet. And Ring, there is a cave off in a little ways, and Ring wants to go and investigate it. Bart doesn't really want to, so they still just sort of like sit there. And then it starts to hail, and the longer it hails, the bigger the like hail itself gets, and Ring seriously injures himself, like he gets concussed. And so Bart has to drag him into the cage or into the cave, and in the cave he sees all these brilliantly colored, like crystalline things, and it stops hailing. Ring wakes up. Uh-oh, Bart has broken his wrist, which he wasn't supposed to do because he won't pass an x-ray. But he drags. Oh no, he goes to the ship to get help for Ring, and while he's there, he's ordered to go to a medic that he's already seen before, and she knows that he is not Lhari because he keeps mentioning color like a dingus. And so she covers for him. And Ring comes in. He's been concussed, but he's taken care of. And now, yeah, she like wraps up his arm and pretends like it's not broken because if it's broken, then they will insist on an x ray. And then Bart is sent off to his quarters. Yes. All right. All right. We'll do one more. Yeah. Chapter 10. The green sun Meristem lay far behind them. Carol's burns had healed. Only a faint pattern on Ring's forehead showed where 6 stitches had closed the ugly wound in his skull. Bart's wrist, after a few days of nightmarish pain when he tried to pick up anything heavy, had healed. 2 more warp drive shifts through space had taken the Swiftwing far out to the rim of the known galaxy, and now the great crimson coal of Antares burned in their viewpoints. Antares had 12 planets, the outermost of which, far away now, at the furthest point in its orbit from the point of the south of the Swift Wing's entry into the system, was a small captive sun, no larger than the planet Earth. It revolved every 90 years around its huge primary. Small as it was blazingly blue-white brilliant and had a tiny planet of its own. After their stop on Antares 7, the largest of the inhabited planets in this system where the Lhari spaceport was located, they would make a careful orbit around the great red primary and land on the tiny wordlet of the blue-white secondary before leaving the Antares system. As Bart watched Antares growing in the viewports, he felt a variety of emotions. On the one hand, he was relieved that as his voyage in secrecy neared its official destination, he had as yet not incurred unmasking. But he felt uncertain about his father's co-conspirators. Would they return him to human form and send him back to Vega, his part ended? Or would they, unthinkably, demand that he go on into the Lhari galaxy? What would they do if they did? At one moment, he entertained fantasies of going on into the Lhari worlds, returning victorious with the secret of their fueling location, or of the star drive itself. At another, he could not wait to be free of it all. He longed for the society of his own people, yet ached to think that this voyage between the stars must end so soon. They made planetfall of the largest Lhari spaceport Bart had seen. As always, the second officer was the first to go through Decontam and ashore, returning with exchanged mail and messages for the Swiftwing's crew. He laughed when he gave Bartol a sealed packet. "You're not quite the orphan we've always thought." Bart took it, his heart suddenly pounding, and walked away through the groups of officers and crew eagerly debating how they would spend their port leave. He knew what it would be. It was on the letterhead of 8 colors, and it contained no message, only an address and a time. He slipped away unobserved to the Mentorian part of the ship to borrow a cloak from Meta. She did not ask why he wanted it, and stopped him when he would have told her. I'd rather not know. She looked very small and very scared, and Bart wished he could comfort her. But he knew she would shrink from him, repelled and horrified by his Lhari skin, hair, claws. Yet she reached for his hand, gripping it hard in her own dainty one. "Bartle." "Be careful," she whispered, then stopped. "Bartle. That's a Lhari name. What's your real one?" "Bart. Bart Steele." "Good luck, Bart." There were tears in her gray eyes. With the blue cloak folded around his face, hands tucked in the slits at the side, he felt almost like himself. And as the strange crimson twilight folded down across the streets, laden with spicy smells and little, fragrant gusts of wind, he almost savored the sense of being a conspirator, of playing for high stakes in a network of intrigue between the stars. He was off on an adventure, and meant to enjoy it. The address he had been given was a lavish estate, not far from the spaceport, across a little gleaming lake that shimmered red, indigo, violet in the crimson sunset, surrounded by a low wall of what looked like purple glass. Bart, moving slowly through the gate, felt that eyes were watching him, and forced himself to walk with slow dignity. Up the path, up a low flight of black marble stairs. A door swung open and shut again, closing out the red sunset, letting him into a room that seemed dim after the months of Lhari lights. There were 3 men in the room, but his eyes were drawn instantly to one, standing against an old-fashioned fireplace. He was very tall and quite thin, and his hair was snow-white, though he did not look old. Bart's first incongruous thought was, he'd make a better Lhari than I would. His firm, commanding voice told Bart at once that this was the man in charge. "You are Bartle." He extended his hand. Bart took it and found himself gripped in a judo hold. The other 2 men, leaping to place behind him, felt all over his body, not gently. "No weapons, Montano. Look here." "Save it," Montano said. "If you're the right person, you'll understand. If not, you won't have much time to resent it. Very simple test. What color is that divan?" "Green." "And those curtains?" "Darker green, with gold and red figures." The men released him, and the white-haired man smiled. "So you actually did it, Steele. I thought for sure the code message was a fake." He stepped back and looked Bart over from head to foot, whistling. "Raynor 3 is a genius. Claws and everything. What a deuce of a risk to take, though." "You know my name," Bart said. "But who are you?" Suspicion came back into the dark eyes. "Does that Mentorian cloak mean you've lost your memories, too?" "No," said Bart. It's simpler than that. I'm not Rupert Steele. His voice caught. "I'm his son." The man looked startled and shocked. "I suppose that means Rupert is dead." "Dead. It came a little before he expected it, then." "So you're Bart." He sighed. "My name's Montano. This is Hendrik. And I suppose you recognize Raynor, too?" Bart blinked. It was the same face, but it was not grim like Raynor 1's, nor expressive and kindly like that of Raynor 3. This one just looked dangerous. "But sit down," Montano said, with a wave of his hand. "Make yourself comfortable." Hedrick relieved Bart of his cloak. Raynor, too, put a cup of something steaming drink in his hand, passed him a tray of small, hot-fried things that tasted crisp and delicious. Bart relaxed, answering questions. How old? Only 17. And you came all alone on a Lhari ship working your way as astrogator. Must say you got guts, kid. It was dangerously like the fantasy he had invented. But Montano interrupted at last. All right. This isn't a party and we haven't all night. I don't suppose Bart has either. Enough time wasted. Since you walked into this, young Steele, I take it you know what our plans are after this? Bart shook his head. No. Raynor 3 sent me to call off your plans because my father— That sounds like 3, interrupted Raynor 2. Entirely too squeamish. Montano said irritably. We couldn't have done anything without a man on the Swift Wing, and you know it. We still can't. Bart, I suppose you know about Lhari. Not by that name. Your next stop, the planetoid of the captive sun. That little hunk of bare rock out there is the first spot the Lhari visited in this galaxy, even before Mentor. It's an inferno of light from that little blue-white sun, so of course they love it. It's just like home to them. When they found that the inner planets of Antares were inhabited, they built their spaceport here, so they'd have a better chance at trade. Montano scowled fiercely. But they wanted that little worldlet, so we went all over it to be sure there were no rare minerals here, and finally leased it to them, a century at a time. They mine the place for some kind of powdered lubricant that's better than graphite. It's all done by robot machinery. No one's stationed there. Every time a Lhari ship comes through the system, they stop there, even though there's nothing on Lhari except a landing field and some concrete bunkers filled with robot mining machinery. They'll stop there on the way out of this system, and that's where you come in. We need you on board to put the radiation counter out of commission. He took a chart from the drawer, spread it out on the tabletop. The simplest way would be to cut these 2 wires. When the Lhari land, we'll be there, waiting for them. On board the Lhari ship, there must be full records, coordinates of their homeworld, of where they go for their catalyst fuel, all that. Bart whistled. But won't the crew defend the ship? You can't fight energon ray guns. Montano's face was perfectly calm. No, we won't even try. He handed Bart a small strip of pale yellow plastic. Keep this out of sight of the Mentorians, he said. The Lhari won't be able to see the color, of course, but when it turns orange, take cover. What is it? Radiation exposure film. It's exactly as sensitive to radiation as you are. When it starts to turn orange, it's picking up radiation. If you are aboard the ship, get into drive chambers. They're lead-lined, and you'll be safe. If you're out on the surface, you'll be all right inside one of the concrete bunkers. But get under cover before it turns red, because by that time, every Lhari of them will be stone cold dead. Bart let the strip of plastic drop, staring in disbelief at Montano's cold, cruel face. Kill them? Kill a whole shipload of them? That's murder. Not murder. War. We're not at war with the Lhari. We have a treaty with them. The Federation has, because they don't dare do anything else, Montano said, his face taking on the Fantastic's light. But some of us dare do something. Some of us aren't going to sit forever and let them strangle all humanity, hold us down, let us die. It's war, Bart. War for economic survival. Do you suppose the Lhari would hesitate to kill anyone if we did anything to hurt their monopoly of the stars? Or didn't they tell you about David Briscoe? How they hunted him down like an animal? But how do we know that was Lhari policy and not just some fanatic? Bart asked suddenly. He thought of the death of the elder Briscoe, and as always, he shivered with the horror of it. But for the first time it came to him. Briscoe had provoked his own death. He had physically attacked the Lhari, threatened them, goaded them to shoot him down in self-defense. I've been on shipboard with them for months. They're not wanton murderers. Raynor 2 made a derisive sound. Sounds like it might be 3 talking. Hedrick growled. Why waste time talking? Listen, young Steele, you'll do as you're told, or else. Who gave you the right to argue? Quiet, both of you. Montano came and laid his arm around Bart's shoulders persuasively. Bart, I know how you feel, but can't you trust me? You're Rupert Steele's son, and you're here to carry on what your father left undone, aren't you? If you fail now, there may not be another chance for years. Maybe not in our lifetimes. Bart dropped his head in his hands. Kill a whole shipload of Lhari. Innocent traitors. Bald, funny old Rugal. Stern Varangal. Ring. I don't know what to do. It was a cry of despair. Bart looked helplessly around at the men. Montano said, almost tenderly, You couldn't side with the Lhari against men, could you? Could a son of Rupert Steele do that? Bart shut his eyes, and something seemed to snap within him. His father had died for this. He might not understand Montano's reasons, but he had to believe that Montano had them. All right, he said thickly. You can count on me. When he left Montano's house, he had the details of the plan, had memorized the location of the device he was to sabotage, and accepted, from Montano, a pair of dark contact lenses. The light's hellish out there, Montano warned. I know you're half Mentorian, but they don't even take their Mentorians out there. They're proud of saying no human foot has ever touched Lharilis. When he got out to the Lhari spaceport, Ring hailed him. Where have you been? I hunted the whole port for you. I wouldn't join the party till you came. What's a pal for? Bart brushed by him without speaking, disregarding Ring's surprised stare, and went up the ramp. He reached his own cabin and threw himself down in his bunk, torn in two. Ring was his friend. Ring liked him, and if he did what Montano wanted, Ring would die. Ring had followed him and was standing in the cabin door, watching him in surprise. Bartol, is something the matter? Is there anything I can do? Have you had more bad news? Bart's torn nerves snapped. He raised his head and yelled at Ring, Yes, there is something. You can quit following me around and just let me alone for a change. Ring took a step backward. Then he said very softly, Suit yourself, Bartol. Sorry. And noiselessly, his white crest held high, he glided away. Bart's resolve hardened. Loneliness had done odd things to him. Thinking of Ring, a Lhari, one of the freaks who had killed his father, as a friend. If they knew who he was, they would turn on him, hunt him down as they hunted Briscoe, as they'd hunted his father, as they'd hounded him from Earth to Procyon. He put his scruples aside. He'd made up his mind. They could all die. What did he care? He was human, and he was going to be loyal to his own kind. End of chapter 10. All right, chapter 10. We have landed. We've landed the ship, and this is where Bart is supposed to meet his contact. He has no idea who this contact is, but he's supposed to meet him, and he does. There is like a little fun gathering party at the ship with the crew because of a successful, voyage. And he goes there. Montano is questioning him to make sure that it's actually him, and so he's asking him like the color of different things because Lhari can't see color, but humans can. And he's convinced. He's like, "Oh, Steele, thank you so much. I'm glad that you're here. You made it. Blah blah blah." And he's Montano is there with Raynor 2, who Bart did not meet. Bart met Raynor 1 and Raynor 3, and also with somebody else. And Bart has to tell them that his dad died and that he's not actually his dad, he's his son. And it is revealed that they being Montano, I am definitely saying his name wrong, aren't I? As soon as I look away from the page, I have no idea what people's names are. Montano. There we go. Montano's plan is to blow up the ship and everybody on it. And now Bart is like having second thoughts because the people that he's been traveling with, the Lhari that he's been traveling with, are not terrible people. They're not murderers. They're just traitors. They just go around and do what they do. And Montano is like, no, you're either with us and going to continue out your father's plan, or you're against us, and this is war now. And so now Bart said that he would, go along with this plan. So he gets the whole plan, and he has this little strip of paper that he's supposed to keep hidden. And when it reaches certain colors is when he's supposed to take safety because of radiation. I hate it. I hate it so much. So, yeah. Yeah. Humans are always the bad guys in these stories, aren't they? It seems like it. So, we'll see. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. But that's all for tonight, folks. I could Porky Pig it, but I'm not going to. But that's it for today. Thank you all so much for being here. It is a pleasure, as always. Whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye, friends.